Okay, so we're looking at quadratic equations. We're trying to find roots or zeros of quadratic equations, whether they be real or imaginary, or whether they be rational or irrational. We still have to try to figure out what these roots are. And one method that can be used that will work for any quadratic equation is something called completing the square. And the completing the square actually uses the square root property. And in order to do so, we manipulate an equation until one side is a perfect square. And when we do that, then we can use the square root property to come up with the roots. And we will end up with all kinds of crazy numbers and such. Now, to kind of give us the beginning step of this, how could we take one side of an equation and make it a perfect square? So our quadratic formula in standard form is x squared, or ax squared, I should say, plus bx plus c. And here we're being asked to find the value that makes this expression right here, x squared plus negative 14x plus c. What could we do to make that a perfect square? And this is just really the beginning step of how we're going to use this concept of completing the square to actually solve equations. So let's look at this, what we have here. So if we were going to complete the square of any quadratic expression in the form of x squared plus bx, just this portion right here, in other words, we're trying to ask ourselves, what does c have to equal for x squared minus 14x to become a perfect square? Here's the steps we follow. We take this linear coefficient, this bx, this linear coefficient, in this case it's negative 14, and we take 1/2 of it. So if I take negative 14 and divide it by 2, I get negative 7. Well, then step 2 is to square what I got in step 1. In this case, that's negative 7. Well, negative 7 squared is 49. Okay, so then this, I could say, if I do like this, that x squared minus 14x plus 49, well, that makes that a perfect square, and I could write that as x minus 7 squared. And if I FOIL that out, x minus 7 squared, well, x times x is x squared, and x times negative 7 is negative 7, and negative 7 times x is negative 7x, and then negative 7 times negative 7 is 49. Then I'd end up with x squared minus 14x plus 49. Okay, now, again, this is just the beginning step of how we can use something called completing the square to solve any quadratic expression. And of course, when we mean solve a quadratic expression, we're talking about finding the roots, finding the zeros. So the first thing we have to do is set the left side, if you will, into the form of a perfect square. Now, next up, and where this may begin to make a little more sense into what we're talking about, is how we're going to use completing the square to solve an equation.